Today we're going to talk about the theological virtues, the last three virtues that we need to cover in this particular lesson. Now, this video, as you can probably tell, is going to be a little bit different from the ones that you have been taking notes on up to this point. The first big difference is that I'm covering three virtues in one video today. The second big difference is it's formatted a bit differently, and what you're going to need to write down in your notes is anything in the presentation that's going to pop up in just a second that's written in black text, and I'll point out the difference between those two when it happens. And third, I'm going to give you some helpful hints on how to identify whether or not a character in a text, in a story, is exemplifying the virtue of faith, the virtue of hope, or the virtue of love. And I'll try to get through this at a relaxed but still efficient pace for you guys. So we'll start off our presentation here, and I'll just point out that everything that's written in black is what you for sure need to write down in your notebook. So as you can see, the theological virtues here is written in black, and down here, faith, hope, and love, that's written in sort of a gray text. You can write that if you want, but anything that's in gray is optional. Anything that's in black, you definitely need in the notebook. Let's start by talking about faith. The virtue of faith, as defined by the Catholic Catechism, is something like man freely committing his entire self, her entire self to God, and living according to that conviction. The definition I really want you to familiarize yourself with is something like this. Faith is a commitment to convictions based not merely on the self-evident nature of the principle, but as an outgrowth of trust in the one proclaiming that particular truth. Another way of thinking about that is something like a powerful trust in not just an idea, but the one who proclaims an idea, and the outgrowth and the workings of that idea in everyday life. I have this image here on the presentation of Frodo Baggins in The Lord of the Rings, and there's the scene where he's in the spider's cave and he holds up this light to show him the way through the labyrinth, right, and to help him fight off the monster. And I think that is a really great metaphor for what it looks like to have faith. I know that sometimes we like to go to the idea from the Bible of faith being like a shield, and there is some merit to that idea, but for our purposes in talking about the virtues, I think a light is actually a more helpful metaphor for what we're trying to do in this class. A light shows you the path. It helps you navigate the way through chaotic situations. And that's what faith does. It's like a light, it's like a conviction that helps guide your decision making at any given time. To display faith is navigating through chaos by following the truth that goes before us. In our case as Christians, that's the Word. That's Christ himself. That's the Logos, the Word made flesh. So when might a character show faith? I'm going to get into a little bit more of this towards the end of the presentation, but I'm going to point some out right now so that we can draw a really helpful distinction between faith and hope, because it can be easy to get them mixed up. So a character shows faith when they have a strong belief or a conviction that drives them to the good or to do good. They also need to believe in an objective truth. They need to have a sense, a moral compass that there is actually a right and there is actually a wrong. And their beliefs and convictions will lead them closer to a quote-unquote heaven rather than a quote-unquote hell. What they do is a movement towards something good, that sort of resurrection that we long for in the depths of our souls. And I think that's a good transition into talking about hope. Now, hope will be defined in this class as a view towards the future that informs our momentary choices. Hope is something like we know that we have a limited perspective on the things happening around us, the things going on in the world, the things that we can't control in our own lives. And hope is sort of like resting in uncertainty. It's the knowledge that we can only do so much. Hope compels us to look beyond our present circumstances to the joy on the other side, let's call it. You know, what's beyond the horizon, the promise that has been given to us. There's a great phrase that I think sums up this idea really well. The shadow proves the sunshine. We might feel like we're surrounded in shadows, but the fact that there is a shadow to begin with is proof that there's a sun. There's a light source behind the thing that's blocking the light. So to be in the shadow is proof that there is something beyond the shadow. And when someone displays hope, they display an understanding of this idea that there is darkness before the dawn, that there is hope on the other side of our present circumstances. The resurrection is such a great example of this. And I have a term that I need to define here for you. To display hope is to long for a eucatastrophe. The term is eucatastrophe. That's a really great word, and you probably recognize most of the word there. Catastrophe is in it. Eucatastrophe means the sudden turn from bad to good. J.R.R. Tolkien actually coined this term, right? Whereas a catastrophe would be like the sudden turn from something good to something bad, a eucatastrophe is the sudden turn of something bad to something good, right? And you see that all over his stories. You see that all the time in our literature and the stories we tell each other. And the resurrection is the greatest example of that. When God was killed, the darkness gave way to dawn. Christ rose up out of the grave. And an understanding that this is a possibility in our lives, that this is something that we can look forward to, that a eucatastrophe is part of the fabric of our lives, right? It leads to a greater outpouring of love for one another through the incarnation of that hope. It's not escapism. It's not a false optimism. It's not something fleeting, right? It's something we know is part of the human story and is part of something that we'll experience. So to understand that there is something worthwhile, that there is something glorious on the other side of the struggles that we go through, is to display the virtue of hope. Now, what I want to do in these next couple slides, and I'll go through these pretty quickly, is to show how faith and hope are actually different. I've seen many times in the past that these are easy to confuse with one another or to think that they sort of mean the same thing. If you want something to help you understand that a little more clearly, think of it this way. Faith is the way, hope is the place. Faith is how we get to the destination. Hope is the understanding that there is a destination. If you have faith, you can find your way. Remember the metaphor of the light, right? We use that to move through our present circumstances. And if we have hope, we know where we are going. We understand what's beyond our present circumstances. So faith is like what you need in the moment to navigate through chaos. Hope is what we know is on the other side of chaos, is knowing that there is something worthwhile striving for. Faith allows you to navigate the path, and hope means that you know the destination, that you know where the destination is. I'm happy to provide further clarification if you have any questions, but I hope that that makes it clear what it means to exemplify faith versus what it means to have hope. Now let's close out by talking about charity or love. You'll see a little bit of overlap with fortitude here because I think that they do reinforce each other as virtues quite a bit, but love specifically can be defined in this class as the ability to pity, to sacrifice, and to forgive. And practicing this virtue leads us towards freedom. It leads us towards liberation. To practice the virtue of charity is to live our lives in such a way that we are animated by the prospect of forgiving one another, that we are motivated by the idea of giving of ourselves, of sacrificing for one another. And we use what Christ has done for us as the example. Someone who shows charity is someone who stands before God not in fear, not as if we're driving some sort of bargain with God, I'll act this way and you'll bless me, right? But as a child responding to the love of him who first loved us. And this is what God continually asks us to do, to love our enemies, to pray for those who persecute us, to bless those who curse us, right? To make ourselves the neighbor of those who are farthest away, to love the least regarded among us, as Christ himself would have done, right? That's the idea behind the parables that Christ told, especially the Good Samaritan, as you can see in the stained glass relief there. Really what it is to live our lives as an imitation of Christ Jesus. And you hear that idea thrown around so much. I'm sure you guys have heard that idea many, many times. But to really dig into that and to really live in such a way where we are free to act in the way that Christ acted, to live our lives the way Christ lived, that's true freedom. That's true liberation. to be able to do that, that's living free of the bondage of sin, right? None of us can be sinless, but that's the example that Christ sets up for us. That's the imitation of Christ, right? When you practice the virtue of love, the virtue of charity, it moves us closer towards that imitation of Christ. So really, that's what you should be looking for with characters who practice the virtue of love. How close are they imitating Christ Jesus? And it doesn't necessarily have to be explicit in the text either. You don't need to be looking for, like, is this character a Christian or not, right? Because, Luke Skywalker and Simba, aren't Christians in their stories, but they are, in a way, imitations of Christ. Like, if they show that virtue, if they show that their regard for others has led them to live in such a way where they are free, right? And you can see that. You can see them animated by that idea. That's what we're looking for. That's that imitation of Christ. Now, let's just close by talking about some principles you can use to guide yourself as you look for these virtues in literature. I know I gave you some of these for faith already, but let me just give you a couple more. I think this will be helpful. When you're looking for whether or not a character shows faith, ask yourself these questions. Is the character driven to do good by deeply held beliefs or convictions, despite the hardship of sticking with those beliefs? Right? I think that would be a really good way of determining whether a character has faith. Like, are they sticking to their convictions no matter how difficult it is? When you're asking whether a character shows the virtue of hope or not, ask yourself, do they have a perspective towards the future that informs their convictions, right? Do they have a sense of where they're going, of what the goal is, right? Do they look towards that goal with expectation, that they know that eucatastrophe is beyond the horizon, that there will be that sudden turn from bad to good if they stay on course, right? Are they future focused? And when you're asking yourself whether a character or someone in a text shows love or charity, ask, are they more focused on the needs of others than the needs of themselves? And does that characteristic allow them to live in a liberated way? Does it allow them to live more freely? Let me just close with a few minutes on this because we started talking about this in the lecture that we had in class. Simba, when he finally accepts his burden of virtue, it's at the moment where he looks down into the reflecting pool, right? He meets sort of his mentor figure, and he implores him to, look into the water, look at your reflection, right? And initially, he doesn't see anything other than his reflection, and he turns away and says, I don't see anything down there, right? I don't see my father down there. I just see me, right? And that's because at first, when we look within ourselves to see whether we can be virtuous people or not, we only see ourselves and we only see our flaws. Remember, Simba has kind of abdicated all his responsibilities at this point. He's living in the woods with his hippie friends, right? And he's refused the call to go back and be the king. But his mentor, the person who's trying to get him to manifest who he truly is, who he is truly capable of being, tells him to look harder and to see that his father lives within him. And it's only after he does that, after he stares himself in the face, right, that you can see past your own flaws and your own imperfections and see who you are capable of becoming. That's when he sees his father's reflection, and that's when he's able to discuss who he's become with his father, right? That's prayer, right? That's the understanding of who we are. That's the acceptance of sin nature, and that's the taking on of the calling. It's all incredibly symbolic and incredibly relatable to whatever we're going through, especially in the life of a Christian. And I'll just point out some ways in the film where we see these theological virtues manifested. He now has faith in the eternal Father. He has this conviction that's going to drive him to return to the kingdom, right? He has hope in the destiny. He has a vision for what can be when he ascends and takes his place, becomes who he was born to be. And he has charity for the suffering. This is something he didn't have before. When Nala tells him that everyone's starving, that there's the famine in the land, that didn't mean much to him. He's like, it doesn't matter to me, I have plenty of bugs to eat, right? But he eventually realizes that true freedom and true liberation comes from living in a way where you care about those who are suffering. So he has faith in the eternal Father. That's God also, right? There's that imagery is clearly there. Hope in the destiny an understanding of what can be when you live up to your calling, right? And charity for the suffering, understanding that there are needs that need to be met, and you might have the power to meet those needs for those who are suffering. So that's how we'll end today. If you need to review the notes a little bit, you can always rewind the video. You can always access the presentation that I will attach on Google Classroom. And if you have any other questions about understanding these virtues or any of the other virtues that we've been talking about, please let me know.